footballers, youth academy footballers.
Right, yes, thank you everybody. Hello, nice to see you all joining us today. So what I'm going to talk to you about today was actually my Masters by Research last year, and is a publication that I'm hoping to make forthcoming hopefully soon. And this has actually formed the basis of my PhD, which I started at the beginning of February. Start being a loose term due to what's going on at the moment. So I'm just going to get straight into it and talk about why I study transitions. In a recent BT Sport Films documentary in 2018, there was quite an alarming statistic released that 180 out of 1.5 million youth academy players will make it, i.e. they will be successful in the English Premier League. That translates as a percentage of 0.012%. So bearing that in mind, we could say that football apprenticeships are arguably unique. They're not like what you would class as an ordinary apprenticeship in terms of construction, engineering, this kind of thing, because there's no guaranteed job post-completion of the apprenticeship. Furthermore, in football, players are marketable assets. So both the club, the player, the manager, they all want something out of it. So it operates in a slightly different way. Bearing in mind the existing literature that is out there at the moment, there's quite a lot, or as much as there possibly can be in the closed social world that is football, that focuses on transitions into and transitions out of first team football. Now, as a global sport, academics, media are all becoming a lot more interested in mental health interventions and this kind of thing. So the rationale behind this study is that if we are to put our research into practice and implement mental health interventions for those transitioning through the game, arguably we need to know what happens at the beginning of the game if we're going to help them post the end of the game. Furthermore, another rationale is that youth is highly regarded as a very impressionable life stage where young people learn to make decisions, find more about themselves through their relations with spaces and people. So with this in mind, my research question was, what are the experiences of male youth academy players during the transition from full-time school to full-time youth team? So then a whistle-stop tour on what we know in football. As I've already mentioned, success rates are extremely low, and transitions out of football are regarded as extremely detrimental to individuals. There is a growing percentage of literature that is predominantly psychologically based and discusses coping methods, levels of motivation, stresses, that kind of thing. But there's quite a limited amount from a sociological point of view where we learn to understand about the actual environment that these young people are in. And therefore, by understanding the environment, we can hopefully understand their behaviours and the way that they embody a strong athletic identity, that of a footballer. With this comes this notion of occupational inevitability. Now, this is the assumption that successful enrolment in an academy equals a successful high-level playing career. As we've seen from the BT Sports statistic, this isn't always the case. What we do know about football, though, is that this long-standing historical notion of masculinity that George talked about earlier this morning is still very much evident. There's authoritarian behaviours, military-type discipline, that kind of thing. This project was based largely on Chasing the Big Time, which was Andrew Parker's thesis back in 1996. That's given me the sort of basis, if you like, for starting my Masters and now my PhD. More recently, Law in 2018, he's studied conspicuous consumption and this idea of image and identity management and the role of role models. And this has also helped me in my study. So in terms of the theoretical framework then, again, a bit of a whistle-stop tour. So I've used figurational sociology, which is from the German sociologist Norbert Elias. Now, Elias believed that we should not consider individuals without considering society. So we should not consider them as two separate entities. We should consider them as part of one another. So he developed the term figuration, which is a term that's defined as a group or network of mutually orientated and dependent people. Now, within a figuration, within this network are interdependencies, and these are two-way links between individuals, and these are based on relations of power. And the way that these operate determines on what processes and what practices are the outcomes of these two-way links. Another term that he uses is called habitus, and this is embodied social learning or second nature. And this featured quite predominantly in the findings of the study, which I'm going to talk about very, very soon. So briefly on the methods then, this was a qualitative case study of one English Championship football club. And I did 12 semi-structured interviews with players aged 17 to 19 last year in the 2019-2020 football year. And we used criterion purposive convenience sampling, and I used thematic analysis to analyse all the data using Envivo 12. So there was quite a few findings, and I've limited down into one overarching theme that was transitional experiences, and there were 3 types that were identified. The first one was a smoother transition, the second a more difficult transition, and the third an initial transitional shock. And I'm going to talk about each of these in turn now. So the first one was a smoother transition, and this was a term that half of the participants used. That was their perception of their transition experience. And in line with findings from Roderick and Clark, Cushion and Harwood, the reasons they cited for this smoother transition was that their early specialisation or their immersion in the football environment from very, very young was the reason why they didn't find their transition particularly difficult, because they had already started to establish an athletic identity. Their habitus was already something that was evolving. And a lot of these had been playing from the ages of 4, 5, 6-year-old. Also, quite a few of them had parental influence, so their fathers were football managers for their local clubs. So when they became a professional footballer, nothing really changed. Very few of them had to move house, change where they lived, change countries even, anything like that, because some of them had even been at the club from age 5. So by this, we defined this as that they had few or little negative critical moments. Now, I've started to use the term critical moments as opposed to transition. Transition implies that it is processional, it is smooth, it is successful, whereas critical moments can be either positive or negative. And that term encompassed a bit more of the findings that I had. So the second half, the remaining 6, said that their transition was more difficult. It was harder and demanding, a lot more than they expected. And this was for a few reasons. One was physical and mental exhaustion from the physicality of training and playing. It was way harder than half of them expected, as you can see from player 3 there, saying I was able to play pre-games all week and it wouldn't be a problem, whereas I'd play 2 games here and be absolutely blowing. Managing that competitive environment that they found themselves in, where suddenly there might be 3 left backs and they were all really good, or if not better than them, was suddenly something that they had been thrown into this new figuration and something that they had to deal with. So belonging to that figuration became very important for these new scholars, particularly the first years where they were trying to form new interdependencies with the already established second years and indeed staff there. And so this links with Law and Boyce, who found that football clubs have an overarching demonstration of the presence of power imbalances. The third form of transition was that of a shock. And although the term was only used by one of the participants, he described transitioning into this football academy as a complete and utter shock. He had no previous academy experience whatsoever. He had just been playing in Sunday League and had been quite good. And suddenly he got into this new figuration where he wanted to make friends, which is something that Adams and Carr say is very, very important in a sporting environment to combat loneliness. And all of a sudden he was flown into a mixture of power, of competition, where he needed to assert himself and decide whether he could manage the whole academy journey. So I know this is really, really quick whistle stop, and I'd love to talk to you about it all for a lot longer. But to conclude, my main points were that youth is such an impressionable life stage, and it's not linear. So we can't say that each person will transition or experience critical moments in the same way. But early specialisation and immersion in a football environment does have a profound effect on the way that players perceive their transition. And the formation of these new interdependencies and the way that power has a role affects how this athletic identity that they've had for so long is continually evolving and perpetuating that constantly. So if we want to help them long term throughout their football journey, understanding it right at the beginning hopefully will help us manage that in the future. So whistle stop tour, but I hope that was enlightening for you all, and I've got my details there if anyone would like to ask me questions now or in the future.
Brilliant.